Holy Troublemakers and Unconventional Saints, a book written by Deneen Ackers. Join Eleanor Arthur and their mother Elizabeth and I as we read stories of these remarkable saints on our traveling tour through the West Lawn of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in Seattle, Washington. First, Mr. Rogers, a Presbyterian minister and television host of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. The Reverend Broderick Greer, Episcopal priest. Gustavo Gutierrez, serving the most vulnerable in Peru. Madia Lin, a founder and director of an LGBTQ and women-centered mosque in Chicago. St. Francis of Assisi, a Christian saint who loved all animals. Bayard Rustin.
Bayard Rustin. As the sun rises on Wednesday, August 28, 1963, people are gathering in Washington, D.C. They have come from all over the country to march in one of the most important protests in the history of the U.S. This is the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, drawing attention to the injustices Black Americans face at a time when much of the country is still segregated. Segregation keeps Black people in separate schools, restaurants, motels, movie theaters, and more. Black and white people even use different drinking fountains and bathrooms, with the better ones reserved for white people. A movement demanding that Black Americans be treated as equals to white Americans has been growing for more than 100 years. A charismatic and powerful preacher named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is one of many leaders of the civil rights movement. Later this day, a crowd of at least 250,000 people will listen to him give a speech that will become famous at his I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington powerfully showed Congress that people wanted civil rights legislation. It also demonstrated that the movement was well organized. The movement and its brilliant chief organizer worked hard to make sure that the day's turnout and the speeches would have an impact. At the end of the day, the chief organizer of the march was deeply satisfied, and the details worked out so well. He had thought about everything from how many bathrooms they needed to provide to the signs marchers would hold. And he had also found a large team of volunteers who stayed late into the night picking up every piece of trash before going home. But this man largely stayed out of the news. He was forced into the background because he was a gay man, and being gay was something most people didn't talk about in 1963. In fact, being openly gay was illegal then, and people who were known to be gay faced a lot of prejudice. Today, we can remember this hero that history forgot. His name was Bayard Rustin. Bayard was born in 1912 in Pennsylvania and raised by his Quaker grandparents. Quakers are a group of Christians who believe deeply in peace and justice, nonviolent methods to work for peace, and the equality of all people. Bayard gave credit to his faith for the lifelong work. My activism did not spring from my being gay, for that matter, or my being Black, he said. Rather, it is rooted fundamentally in my Quaker upbringing and the values that were instilled in me by my grandparents who reared me. Those values are based on the concept of a single human family and the belief that all members of that family are equal. A major teaching of Quakers is pacifism, the belief that war is wrong. As a Quaker, Bayard did not believe in using violence, even in times of war. Instead, he used nonviolent ways to resist policies and laws he believed were wrong. register for the draft to become a soldier in the World War II because he was a pacifist. For this, he was sent to federal prison in 1944. While in prison, he worked to organize other inmates to protest segregation rules that prohibited black and white prisoners standing in line or eating together. In April of 1947, not long after his release from federal prison, Bayard rode a bus through several southern states with 15 other men. They were black men and white men traveling together, which made this trip uniquely dangerous. Their goal was to test a new law about people traveling through more than one state. The Supreme Court had just ruled that these people, called interstate passengers, did not have to obey state rules that required segregated seating. Under segregation, white people sat in front of buses and black people sat in the back. Bayard and his friends planned to make sure that bus drivers in the South were following the new law. The people in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, were so angry about black men and white men sitting together on buses that Bayard was arrested along with several other of his travel companions. The vehicle carrying them to await trial was followed by 2 cars full of angry white men, and one of Bayard's companions was assaulted. Despite the Supreme Court ruling, the North Carolina court ruled that since they were not traveling interstate that exact day, they were not technically interstate passengers, even through their overall trip schedule was not interstate. Bayard was tired and sentenced to 30 days of hard labor on a chain gang. Bayard's time in the chain gang was both difficult and motivating. The hot sun beat down on him. The guards were cruel, and the work exhausted him. But even in those difficult conditions, he noticed the songs that the prisoners sang to keep their spirits up. Bayard loved music and had studied music in college. When he was released and home again in New York, Bayard wrote about his brutal treatment in the chain gang for a New York City-based newspaper. His report helped end the practice of chain gangs for the next 60 years. Unfortunately, this practice is returning in some parts of the U.S. Bayard next traveled to India to study nonviolent resistance for Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi's decades-long nonviolent campaign opposing British rule in India had succeeded when India and Pakistan became independent. Bayard wanted to immerse himself in the principles of nonviolent resistance that had led to the overthrow of an empire. Nonviolent means more than just not using physical violence. It means taking peaceful action to bring about change, including sit-ins, marches, hunger strikes, boycotts, pickering, and more. The larger goal of nonviolent resistance is to convince the people doing harmful, racist, and violent acts that their actions are wrong. People aren't seen as the enemy in nonviolent movements. Instead, the ignorance that leads to harmful acts is the enemy. While he was in India, Bayard came to believe even more deeply that nonviolent resistance was the only way to win true equality for Black Americans and to win over the hearts and minds of the majority of white Americans. He believed that people who cared about changing unjust systems needed to become troublemakers for the higher good. We need in every community a group of angry troublemakers, he said. Our power is an ability to make things unworkable. The only weapon we have is our bodies, and we need to tuck them in places so wheels don't turn. Once he got back to the U.S., Bayard got involved with the civil rights movement and its leaders, including Dr. King. In fact, Bayard convinced Dr. King that nonviolence was an ideology or philosophy of life that could work for the movement. He also convinced Dr. King not to use armed bodyguards or to keep guns at his home for self-protection, because the leader of a nonviolent resistance movement could not prepare to use violence while preaching nonviolence to his followers. Other leaders of the growing civil rights movement questioned Bayard's role. Many of them had prejudice against gay people, but Bayard became a trusted advisor to Dr. King, both for the practical knowledge of nonviolent techniques and his magnificent organizing skills. The March on Washington, which violent resistance worked on behalf of racial recognition and equality. Bayard loved all people, and while he worked for much of his life on civil rights for African Americans, he also worked as a human rights activist in many other countries, including India, Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa. He cared deeply about refugees and helped bring awareness to the hardships faced by refugees from Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and And these are just a few examples of the many freedom and equality projects he worked on. Bayard believed that humans are all part of the same family. We are all one, he said. And if we don't know it, we will all learn it the hard way. Bayard Rustin died in 1987. In 2013, 50 years after the historic march in Washington, President Obama awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest honor a civilian can receive. Bayard's partner of 10 years, Walter Nagel, was on hand to accept the award that honored Bayard for being one of America's greatest architects of social change. Finally, history is starting to remember Bayard Rustin, who taught us how to be angelic troublemakers on behalf of peace, freedom, and the shared humanity of us all. How might you be an angelic troublemaker in your community?
Rabbi Danya Rutenberg, an educator and author. Wangari Maathai, a Kenyan social and environmental activist who won the Nobel Peace Prize. Thank you for joining us today for this tour of these remarkable saints. As Jesus says in our gospel this morning, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. No truer words, I believe, exemplify these holy troublemakers and unconventional saints who work tirelessly on behalf of justice. You can continue to see this exhibit up through October 1st, 2020 at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in Seattle, Washington.